Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. I'm so excited to be here. I was not supposed to be here, but it was my luck that Kiese Lehman couldn't make it, and I was like, yes, thank you. I was telling Sarah backstage that the first time I heard about the Yellow House, it wasn't published yet, and Terry McMillan, who, you all know who Terry McMillan is, yeah. She's a good friend of mine, and she was raving about this memoir. And I had started working on my own memoir, and so I had stopped reading fiction, and I was just reading nonfiction. And The Yellow House came out, and I listened to it as I was walking through New Orleans. I've only been in New Orleans for about, at that time, 4 years, I think. And so I didn't know the city beyond what tourists know about the city. And your book just opened up my eyes. Can you talk about, Ayanna Mathis, the author Ayanna Mathis said it was a love letter to your family. And I think it's a love letter to your family and it's a love letter to New Orleans. And I'd like to know, was that your intention?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. That's a good, so I have to say first that I'm honored to talk with you because this is, have you read all of Bernice McFadden's novels? And now we're going to read your memoir that you finished yesterday?
I did.
So there's this obsession I have that has to do with place and sort of spatial ways of being and geography. And there's this film, Last Black Man in San Francisco, and there's this wonderful scene where they're on the bus and this woman is talking about how much she loves San Francisco, and they get into this conversation, and the guy says, you know, you can't love something if you don't hate it. And you know, like they're both part of the same spectrum, right? And also James Baldwin said, right, because I love America so much, it's my job to criticize it interminably. And I could go on and on about all the writers who talk about this, right? And so I think for me, it's so intriguing to be from a place and to admit the ways you don't quite understand it. And I think that process of trying to understand it is for me a form of love. And so I wrote it not thinking so much about love in this flat way, right, that it's so often sort of put to us in the society, but to sort of think about how I might interrogate this place that composed me in so many ways, and try to get to know it through these other angles by extension. So maybe the love part just came out of that, you know?
So that leads me to the next question, because I learned so much. I want to know, in your research, because we're talking 100 years of history, multi-generational, sweeping, epic, all the words, all the things. What did you stumble across in your research that you found surprising, intriguing, halting?
Oh, so much, right? I mean, the book was really hard to wrangle, and it's hard to talk about it now because, I think you know this. You know, you write a book, and then you need to instantly forget it.
Yes.
Because it's, in order to write another one, you'd be tortured if you remembered exactly how you did it, right? Because it's so painful and painstaking. And so I think there were these moments where it's one thing to think you know something. For instance, I had all these narratives about my childhood friend Alvin and the way that he died. I had a very specific story of how that had happened. And then to sort of go back and fact check my memory and be in the archives and actually go and figure out and look up go on the microfiche and actually read the article about his death and to realize that I had created this narrative that really had nothing to do with the truth.
Right.
And that happened over and over again because it's not, in fact, the kind of memoir where I'm just remembering. It's about evidence, and it's about reporting, and it's about the ways in which we misremember on purpose sometimes, and the ways in which we don't see on purpose. And so there were so many instances in the work of researching it where I misremembered,
Right.
or I thought it was something very, very clearly that it was not. And then I think to do a year of sort of oral history with my family and have them tell disparate stories and then fact check their memory added this other layer of complication, right? So I think the whole work of it was surprising and made me feel quite inept, the whole time.
So The Yellow House for me read like a novel because it has all of the elements of fiction, even though it's factual. What constantly came to mind was the nonfiction novel, Capote in Cold Blood. Have you read that?
Yeah, I love that.
I wonder, because I know there's some aspiring writers here, what does that take? Like, what skill level does that take for you to take a story that is so personal and put it down on the page and make it so accessible?
Oh, so now we're going to get into craft. My favorite. So look, I think, I'm from a storytelling place, and so I think there was a technical problem. Well, there were so many problems, but one of the issues of writing the book was, the book it's not just the content, right? It's the structure. The structure is sort of a boat, and the boat is carrying themes, right? And so in the boat itself, which is the structure of the book, it needed to indicate that it was perhaps a story from someone who was composed by a city like New Orleans. And so rather than fall into trope, right, one of the ways I could indicate that, I think, was through the narrative part of it. And anyone who knows anything about New Orleans knows that one of the greatest strengths of New Orleans are the people, who are some of the best storytellers, I think, on planet Earth. So I think figuring out a way to take this sort of mountain of fact and make these people alive in the way that I actually see them was a huge challenge, because you can't make things up, right? So I think part of it was when I did the interviews and the transcription. So in the beginning, I was transcribing myself, the interviews with my family, because it was a way for me to sort of gain a third ear and hear them as characters. So rather than sort of chronologically tell this story, right, I could understand if I were writing a novel, who would Carl be?
Right.
So in my estimation, Carl is a maroon, right? He's a maroon from beginning to end. And so I only knew that, though, through the vis-a-vis the facts.
Right.
Right? And so once I had him as a character, then he wasn't my brother in the same way. Right? And so one of the technical pieces was, okay, you've done 5, 6, 7 drafts, and then maybe the 8th or 9th version, I'm only reading each character for arc. Even though they're true people and this is all their quotations and this is real, maybe I just read the book from beginning to end, but only my mother's parts.
Right.
So I see how she moves and develops as a character, because life is very narrative.
Yes.
Right? And then there are moments when people are cut back, or the tension is increased, or you hear less of them. And that's purposeful too. And then some people become main characters and some become minor. And my own self as the narrator of this story, I actually don't think it's a book about me, because it's in fact a book about how I belong to this particular geography, which includes the geography of my family. So it's actually a book about a girl who is the baby of 12. which is very different from how I see myself.
Right.
Right?
And that I want you to like expand on that a little bit because, and this is a selfish thing, I had to write about myself in my memoir. And I found it very difficult. I've been writing about myself for years under the guise of fiction, right? But, so how did you handle that? Because it is a very vexing sort of thing, because you want to be honest. And in first person, it's unreliable. Am I telling my full truth? Because I could tell your story all day long and be like, this is the truth, whether it shames you or not. How did you handle that?
That was so hard because, my training is as a reporter.
Right.
And so I really have no experience sort of self-reflecting in that way on the page. I think if I could think of myself as a character, so if I were forced to think of the person who is narrating this book, so in the early days I would go around and talk to my friends very vaguely about the book because I hate talking about books, right, as I'm making them. And I'd say, this narrator, and my friends would say, you mean you? And I'd say, no, I mean the narrator. Because, for instance, the person who told this story is obsessed with not being able to see, right? Because she's this child who can't see for a really long time. I mean, she's like 10 or 11. So in terms of character, that makes me a very specific teller of this story. So I think what I tried to do was to think about craft a lot more than like my own entirety of self, So then I could go and think of the childhood moments that related to that, or I could interview people about those specific moments. The other thing is that I'm an obsessive notebook taker and keeper.
Oh.
And so I could go back. A lot of my high school years, college years were in notebooks. I made notes about them. So I could do this kind of excavating work and go back and think about who that person was then. And then that could become part of the story, right?
Yeah.
Of this person who belongs to this particular place. But I think it's that, that's why the book is arranged so weirdly, where I don't appear quite until 100 pages in. It was a hard thing to figure out how to do.
Yeah. Hopefully I pulled it off, personally.
Oh, I can't wait to see.
Also, when reading/listening to the memoir, I felt that you and your family had such a deep connection with New Orleans, something that went beyond just the physical, the geography. I think when you have people that live on a land for so many generations, a spiritual connection develops. And in my mind, I'm like, well, the Broom family can't exist without New Orleans, and New Orleans can't exist without the Broom family. I want to know, did you feel that way while you were writing the book? Did you feel that way before you started writing the book? Do you feel that way now?
Yes. I'm someone who is very connected to soil, to land. I mean, you could almost drop me off anywhere on earth, and I'll just find a way to relate to the place where I am. And it becomes very organic and natural. And I think my entire family is this way. Part of what made the book what it was meditating on my brother Carl and this particular ritual he had, which at first, before I had a book in mind, it was so stunning to me that he would show up to this land and just cut the grass. I thought, no one's there. Like, who's noticing this, right? But the tradition of him, then he brought a table out there and he set up chairs And, you know, when it got cold, he'd build a fire. And he made this sort of no place, a place. And it got me to thinking about, well, what would happen if I treated 4121 Wilson like the iconic place it actually is? What if I treated this place like one of the more historic destinations in all of New Orleans? If I did that, maybe then I could reshape, right? Or shift a little bit the frame so that these people are, in fact, the central players in their own lives, which they, of course, are. And I think this even now in New Orleans, you know. I think about all the people I know who are so attached to this place, right? Through all kinds of storms and inequities and dysfunctions, and all of us who drive over 20,000 potholes a day know how real that is. And who don't get our trash picked up regularly and don't, you know, can't quite figure out what it means to actually make it here, right? Those are the central players in my book, right? And so I think I gained, through Curl, vis-a-vis Curl and vis-a-vis my entire family, this kind of fervor about talking about this place that just doesn't show up, New Orleans East, right?
Right, yeah. So let's switch to Little Sarah, right? I'm always interested in when writers first discovered that they were writers. I feel like I discovered I was a writer at age 9, and I claimed that for myself. And it was like, that's what I'm going to do with my life. And I took a lot of different pathways to get here, but I made it. And so I'd like to know your story.
Oh. Well, I think I was a very nosy child. And I never, you know, I was always a Capricorn child too, you know. And so my mother laughs because she says that at some point when I was really young and I was listening in on yet another conversation and I was, you know, they were just like, oh my God, we can't say anything around this child. And they were saying, well, we're not going to say that because such and such is in the room, which meant me. And then, and I said something like, well, you know, this really isn't working out for me. You know, being a kid and not having the control I need to have. And so I was going around at that very young, maybe 9 or 10, saying I was going to be a mass communications expert. My mother was like, where did you get these words? But I wasn't a writer in the way that I understand myself to be now, quite literally, when I was young. Though I think I was obsessed with words and the phraseology of things, how people would say things, or the way that words work together. And I think, you know, and I went through life being a nonprofit person and running organizations and being in the magazine world, but still not quite conceiving of myself as a writer. I think I became a writer officially when I wrote this book.
Really?
It was for me the first time that it was my job. It was the thing I invested in. It was the way that I saw, you know. So I feel like I'm a bit of a late. I was always an observer, always a person who loved story, loved questions, you know.
I hear this story all the time.
I was always that person, but I don't know that I was calling myself or thinking of myself even as a writer.
That's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
How many people in the audience have read The Yellow House? Does anybody have a copy? Can somebody bring up a copy for me? Anybody? Thank you. Yep, whoever.
Borrow your book.
Thank you.
Oh, this is good. We
No,
have
just
one now.
Just one. Thank you. Would you mind?
What do you want me to read?
Whatever your heart desires.
Okay, so just a brief thing, huh? From the beginning, maybe? Okay. From high up, 15,000 feet above, where the aerial photographs are taken, 4121 Wilson Avenue, the address I know best, is a minuscule point, a scab of green. In satellite images shot from higher still, my former street dissolves into the toe of Louisiana's boot. From this vantage point, our address, now mite-size, would appear to sit in the Gulf of Mexico. Distance lends perspective, but it can also shade, misinterpret. From these great heights, my brother Carl would not be seen. Carl, who is also my brother Rabbit, sits his days and nights away at 4121 Wilson Avenue at least 5 times a week after working his maintenance job at NASA or when he is not fishing or near to the water where he loves to be. 4,015 days past the water beyond all news cycles known to man, still sits a skinny man in shorts, white socks pulled up to his kneecaps, one gold picture frame around his front tooth. Sometimes you can find Carl alone on our lot, poised on an ice chest, searching the view, as if for a sign, as if for a wonder, or else seated at a pecan-colored dining table with intricately carved legs, holding court. The table where Carl sometimes sits is on the spot where our living room used to be, but where, instead of floor, there is green grass trying to grow. See Carl gesturing with a long arm if he feels like it, wearing dark shades even if it is night. See Rabbit with his legs crossed at the ankle, a long-legged man knotted up. I can see him there now, in my mind's eye, silent and holding a beer, babysitting ruins. But that is not his language or sentiment. He would never betray the yellow house like that. Carl often finds company on Wilson Avenue where he keeps watch. Friends will arrive and pop their trunks, revealing coolers containing spirits on ice. "Help yourself, baby," they will say. If someone has to pee, they do it in what used to be our den. Or they use the bright blue porta potty sitting at the back of the yard where the shed once was. Now, this plastic vertical bathroom is the only structure on the lot. Written on its front in white block letters on black background, City of New Orleans.
That's so beautiful. It's like poetry. It's like poetry. I want to know, who are some of the writers that you find inspiration?
So many. So one of the, like you, I read voraciously when I'm writing. There are writers who say they don't read. I need to read, right? It gives me so much strength. But for instance, Jamaica Kincaid, I kept reading autobiography of my mother in order to understand how you write about loss. So I love Jamaica Kincaid. I'm trying to think, for this book, I read so much Toni Morrison, W.G. Zabald, Joan Didion's Where I Was From, which is about her family and this sort of long ancestral line. So many, Albert Murray. For this book, there were a lot of books about geography, about homesickness, about longing. Richard Campanella, who's one of our local greats, about geography and how New Orleans is essentially put together.
Right.
So I think this book, so many, and someone like Gaston Bachelard, right, in The Poetics of Space. So thinking about philosophy and the ways in which we talk about home and how we organize place and how these sometimes banal seeming things are actually metaphors or portals somehow for where else we might go when we think about home. So this book is full of influences, and I'm in conversation with so many people.
Yes, I picked up on that, absolutely. What do you think, some years back, people were saying that the memoir was dead. And we're seeing so many, right? They said, the memoir is dead, the memoir is dead.
Doesn't everything die at some point?
I guess.
And then it comes back
It
again?
comes back. And I think that I don't feel like I've seen so many memoirs coming out of the Black writers community as what I'm seeing now with these past few years. Why do you think that is? I'm trying to figure what that is. Is it about having space and time to tell our truths instead of having someone else tell our stories?
It's interesting because for forever when I was writing this book, I was saying, I'm writing an autobiography of a house, right? And I just happened to belong to this house, right? And so I think I have a complicated relationship to the idea of memoir to begin with. And I think that's why the book is possibly structured the way that it is, right? It's that's my journalistic impulse. I'm sort of holding on to the very end and showing up as someone very concerned about evidence, right? And I think that's what I'm most interested in, even in terms of the community of people who are writing memoir. What do these genres look like when we show up with a certain point of view? And what are the ways in which we can sort of stretch and expand these genres based on where we come from? So in my case, I'm part of a choral, right? I mean, there's me and all these other siblings and the 50 nieces and nephews and the fact that I was an auntie before I was born, And so what does that book, that story in particular look like? And I think those are the ways in which, in whatever genre we're writing in, they can start to feel so small, right? They can start to feel, and I think, so what we're doing is showing up and saying very particularly, this is where I come from, this is my point of view, and this is how I have to tell this particular story. And then it's not up to us, right, whether people get it or want it or read it.
Right.
But I think that was my impulse, is to say, how do I read 1,000 pieces of memoir and then think about what a memoir belonging to me looks and feels like?
You said something in this answer about you belonging to the house. That's very interesting. Not the house belonging to you. Can you expand? I love that. I love that.
Well, I think part of it is that I was born into this place, this very specific house. And when I was born into this house, there were so many traces of people I would never meet, like my father, right? My father was alive when I was born, but then died when I was 6 months in the house itself. And so the traces of his death in the house were there. The traces of my mother being pregnant yet again and my siblings' response to that before me were in the house, right? The traces of the people who lived there before me were there, right? And this is also, I think, it was easy for me to see the ways in which that was an extrapolation of what it means to come from New Orleans, and then a further extrapolation of what it means to, in fact, be American. Because when we are born to a place, that is very real. We come to the world and we inherit a set of conditions. We inherit trauma often. We inherit the toxic soil that we're born into. Right now, we're inheriting a lot of things, right? And so the question is, how do you write about that And I think by writing about it in that way, by saying, I belong to this house, it is mine, then I can't abandon it so easily. I can't claim that it's not mine so easily. I have to be not only part of it, but part of the narrative of it. And I think, so it just complicated things for me. And it's also just the way I see our citizenship as members of the world right now.
So this is going to be my final question before we open it up. Backstage, we were talking about how I feel about living here in New Orleans and the dialects, because I said, Sarah doesn't sound like she's from New Orleans, right? But we understand, right, that, you know, maybe people who come from the East sound a particular way, people uptown speak a certain type of way. But there's one dialect that for me resonates, and Sarah wanted to know, well, why was that? And I was like, I think it's on a molecular level. The thing is, which I couldn't pull up when we were speaking, was that, you know, they call New Orleans the northernmost Caribbean island. And that is my connection. I'm like, so when I'm around the certain group of people when they're speaking a certain way, it feels like home. It feels very comfortable to me. And to have so many different dialects in this one place is amazing. What do you think about that? I mean, are you familiar with the whole saying about the northernmost?
Yeah, I have heard that. I mean, it's intriguing because one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was working on this book was the fact that I have these 11 brothers and sisters who are vastly different human beings, vastly different creatures. We all grew up in the same city, the same house. We have the same parents.
You said we all rolled in the same belly.
That's right. We all rolled in the same belly. And just thinking about how people sound and how different they are, and this sort of genius, which I think of as Blackness, actually, to sort of exist on all these multiple registers. You know, that there's a way that we know how to talk to each other when we're in the same room. One of the things that, and this is similar to what you're saying, one of the things that happens in my family, and I feel like I couldn't write this scene quite right, is all of us in one room at a table. Because people are talking over each other and interrupting people's story and denying somebody's story, and it's all happening at the same time. But we're all hearing each other and listening to each other also at the same time. And that sort of brilliance of the multiple register, the way that in this story and in our lives, there is always high, low, that the one thing that Black people are required to do is to work in so many tongues, to speak in many different tongues, to not actually be so flat and one-dimensional, to be read widely, to be able to, for instance, when I was growing up, in English class, I became obsessed with Dostoevsky. I became obsessed with, you know, Tolstoy, Chekhov.
Yeah.
I was reading all those short stories. And then when I meet someone and they're like, you know, they're like, well, what Black writer should I read? I'm like, oh no, no. Because I have to be versed in all the registers, right? I have to be able to understand what Sebald is doing, and to understand what Bernice is doing, and to understand what David Grossman in Israel is doing, and to understand Orhan Pamuk in Istanbul, and right? I mean, I have to, and Nadine Gordimer, and Toni Morrison, right? And so this level of breadth and wideness, I think we see in the miniature, in the way people talk, the dialects, how we are with each other. And that's one of the things I love especially about New Orleans.
Me too.
Yeah.
My favorite thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna open it up to questions now. If you would go to the mic in the middle of the aisle, please. Yes.
Hi, my name's Beth Christensen, and I'm a semi-retired therapist and baby writer. I wanted to ask you about your obvious, really serious quest for fact and how fact relates to truth. Because I came across something terribly traumatic in my life, and the only way I could write about it was to give it to a character. And that was the birth of the novel that is now 20 years in the making. And what I realized is that I couldn't write specifically my story without hurting people, and I don't want to do that. But I could give my story to a set of characters who would be vaguely recognizable, and they wouldn't be factual, but they would be truth. Is that something that you think I can do, or a writer can do?
Yeah. I mean, this is what
I do it all the time.
novelists do.
Exactly.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I always think about, when I am a usually successful novelist and people are interviewing me and saying, well, is this autobiographical? And I kind of think every novel is in some way autobiographical. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Thank you. I love this presentation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
I can't wait to read your book, by the way.
I just want to say with nonfiction, I do think there's an ethical thing, because in my case, I'm writing about my family, so my approach was to interview all of them, to then decide what it was that I wanted to use, and then to say to each of them a long while, in my case, after I'd interviewed them.
Yeah.
So this thing that you told me, it's really important for me to use, because it's building this particular story that I feel I need to tell. There were instances where siblings of mine would say, I forgot that I said that, you can't use it. And then I'd fight with them,
Right.
like baby sisters do.
Right.
And there were moments where I said, that's fair. It's gone. It's as if I never heard it. And so I think when you're working in nonfiction, there is a responsibility you obviously have to all of the people who are alive, whose lives you are actually dealing in. And I think another rule I set for myself was, if you're putting other people on the line, you need to be on the line yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't think this is about craft. I think it's about geography. I live in New Orleans, and my whole life I've gone back and forth on the Chef Menteur. And I think those 3 to 5 miles of the Chef that you grew up in are one of the strangest roads on the entire planet. And you cannot pause without something strange happening to you. And when you came
You
out
understand me, man.
and when you came out with your book that, put it into place and, came down from that satellite, and my wife and I immediately made a pilgrimage to look at the ground that the Yellow House was on. But if you could just talk a little bit about the Chef, because I don't think many people understand it. Most people in New Orleans never go there. But if you could just mention the Chef.
Yeah, no. So the Chef is so. Thank you for that. That's. I actually am a little bit in love with the strangeness of Chef Menteur Highway, and it's one of the highways or places in the book that are personified. So Chef Menteur is actually I think deeply personified in the book, because not only is it this strange stretch that has a really interesting history, right, as the kind of high ridge running through, and the way it bifurcates these different sides of the city is intriguing. Where it can take you, what you might see along the way, what it could have become, i.e. Airline Highway, what it actually didn't become, i.e. Chef Menteur. And then if we go from this kind of great big view to the bird's eye view, The fact that my sister was hit by a speeding car on Chef Menteur Highway because we had to cross Chef Menteur Highway to make it to the rest of our lives, which was the grocery store and school and church and all these different places. That Chef Menteur Highway was this ominous place for us, right? That allowed me to actually interrogate and talk about the absence of city planning, what was happening with zoning. How do you make a highway? How do you widen? Chef Menteur was a narrow road. It became widened, right? It started to draw all this different kind of traffic. It was there were all these motels, right? There were people coming in and out. The Beatles stayed somewhere on Chef Menteur Highway. The research moment when I discovered that the Beatles had come to New Orleans East and passed the short end of the long street where we lived, and asking my siblings if they remembered that moment, and them saying, oh, yeah, we knew the Beatles came, but what was happening on our street that day was. And so Chef is, I think, it could have its own book, right? Maybe one day it will have its own book, actually. And it was yet another example of the way in which I could have gone off on a major tangent.
Right.
But for this book in particular, it represented so much of the city's dysfunction, so much of the city's promise, and on a very personal note, what it's like to grow up with the horror of crossing
Right.
in your life every day.
Oh, my God. Hello.
Hello. I appreciated what you had to say about doing some real research and fact-checking your memory before you produced what you're calling a memoir, because I had always avoided memoirs because they seemed to be much more personal opinion and remembrance than actual fact. And I'm not going to name a terribly popular memoir that I'm not sure half of it was really the way the person remembered it happening. Do you think the publishing world in the future would come up with a distinction between the two? This is a more fact-checked memoir as opposed to this is just the way I'm telling the story and my brother's going to tell a completely different story memoir?
I think that's so good. Look, I think this is all marketing. All right, I don't think I was writing a memoir. I think I was just writing The Yellow House, and they were like, memoir, And so, I don't know. I mean, I think part of the deeper issue is that publishers don't have budgets for fact-checking. I think that's a sort of problem, which no one quite understands this until you turn in your manuscript and they're like, you fact-checked this, right? And you're like, what do you
Aren't you
mean?
gonna
Do
do
you have $20,000 for me to fact-check this? So I think, I remember I was hiring people from local libraries to help me fact-check my own book. I mean, I happen to be a trained journalist, so I know how to do this stuff on some level, but
Right.
there were so many things I got wrong. Even after the book had come out, my siblings would say, it's not Rosemount Baptist Church, it's Rosemary Baptist Church, and I thought I had it right. So it's part of the issue is that we need resources within the publishing world for things like fact-checking.
And memory is very fluid, right? So it's difficult. We
Yeah.
have one last question.
I recall a statement you made toward the end of your book, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was to the effect that New Orleans has created this huge mythology surrounding itself, and it seems to use that to obscure its profound dysfunctions. Can you
Yeah, you said it exactly right.
Can you elaborate any on that?
No, I think that is so much the heart of what I try to talk about, the mythology of place, the mythology of a city, and how that also feeds into the mythology of what it means to be an American. and that these things aren't in fact disparate, that the story you self-create is in fact part of the creation of the place you're from, and that's part of the story of the larger place you're from and your context. So, if you decontextualize yourself, you are unmooring yourself, right? And so the work of creating the rungs of the book, the mythologies, have to do with contextualizing yourself.
Yes. That's it. We're done. Thank you, Sarah. Oh, such a pleasure.